Hey, amazing viewers! Before we go into this riveting narrative, drop your location in the comments below. We love connecting with you all around the world. Also, if this is your first time here, press the subscribe button and join our incredible journey. Let's hit 10,000 subscribers this month together. Your support means everything. An ordinary day turned nightmare. My name is Megan Foster. I'm 42 years old, and for the past 15 years, I've lived what most people would consider a perfectly normal life. I work as an English teacher at Quincy High School. My husband Daniel is a sales manager for a cleaning equipment company, and we have a beautiful 15-year-old daughter, Ashley, who has always been the light of our lives. Our home sits in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside of Boston, where each morning starts the same. Me bustling around the kitchen, getting breakfast ready, calling up to the second floor for Ashley to wake up, while Daniel prepares for his workday. That morning was no different. "Ashley, are you up?" I called, flipping pancakes on the stove. No answer. I sighed. She was always the last to get up, constantly snoozing her alarm. My husband, Daniel, came downstairs at that moment, adjusting his tie, looking slightly preoccupied. "Good morning, Meg," he said with a warm smile before grabbing his coffee. "You seem busy," I noted, raising an eyebrow. He sighed. "I've got a presentation today. A new product launch. I'm a little nervous." I squeezed his hand reassuringly. "You'll do great. You always do." Finally, Ashley came down, her dark curls slightly messy from sleep. She grabbed a piece of toast and bit into it while scrolling through her phone. "Mom, can I go to the mall with my friends after school today?" she asked casually. I hesitated. "Is your homework done?" She smirked, rolling her eyes. "Of course. I finished it all yesterday." I studied her for a moment, then relented. "All right, but be back by 8 p.m. She beamed. "Thanks, Mom." That morning was perfectly ordinary. We ate breakfast together, talked about our plans for the day, and then we each went our separate ways. If I had known that was the last normal moment I'd have with Ashley before everything changed, I would have held on to it a little longer. A knock on the door that changed everything. The first sign that something was wrong came that evening when Daniel returned home. He looked unusually troubled, his brows furrowed in concern. "What's wrong?" I asked as I set the dinner table. After a moment's hesitation, he spoke. "Rachel lost her job." I froze. The mere mention of her name sent a wave of anxiety through me. Rachel was Daniel's younger sister, minus 35 years old, impulsive, reckless, and a magnet for trouble. She had a history of bad decisions, questionable friends, and a string of failures that left chaos in her wake. She had lived with us before, and it hadn't ended well. "She wants to stay with us for a while," Daniel continued cautiously, "just until she gets back on her feet." I set down the plate I was holding and turned to face him. "Daniel, you remember what happened last time?" He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know, Meg, but she's my sister. I think she's changed. She really needs help." I hesitated. My gut screamed no, but I also knew Daniel had a big heart. His kindness was one of the things I loved about him, even if it sometimes blinded him. After a long pause, I finally said, "All right, but if anything happens, I'm putting my foot down." Daniel smiled, relieved. "It'll be fine. This time will be different." But as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Rachel moves in. That Saturday, Rachel arrived on our doorstep with a suitcase and an apologetic smile. "Thank you for letting me stay," she said softly, her dark eyes looking tired. I studied her. She did look different, thinner, worn out, almost fragile. But was it genuine? "Aunt Rachel." Ashley's excited voice interrupted my thoughts. She ran down the stairs and hugged her aunt tightly. I forced a smile. "Welcome, Rachel." That night at dinner, Rachel told us about her job loss. The company had financial problems. Layoffs were inevitable. Daniel nodded sympathetically. Take your time looking for something new. No rush. I remained quiet. I wanted to be supportive, but I couldn't shake the unease growing inside me. Ashley and Rachel grow closer. Over the next few days, Rachel settled into our home, and to my surprise, she and Ashley became inseparable. They stayed up late talking, laughing, sharing stories. Ashley had always admired her aunt. Rachel was wild, adventurous, a free spirit, everything a teenage girl found fascinating. One evening, as I was cooking, I overheard them talking in the living room. Yes, and then in high school, this happened. Rachel's voice trailed off in laughter. I frowned. I remembered Rachel's high school years well. Partying, skipping class, getting into trouble. Those weren't the kinds of stories I wanted her sharing with my daughter. Later that night, I brought it up to Daniel. Rachel's influence on Ashley worries me. He shrugged. Ashley's old enough to make her own choices. Besides, I think it's good for her to have someone else to talk to. I didn't argue, but my gut told me something wasn't right. The nightmare begins. Friday evening, I returned home from work, reflecting on my day. My students had an engaging discussion about Romeo and Juliet, and for a moment, I felt a sense of accomplishment. As I was preparing dinner, Ashley walked in. I'm home. I turned to greet her, but my smile faded immediately. Ashley looked pale. Her usual bright energy was gone, replaced by exhaustion. Ashley, are you okay? I asked, concerned. She rubbed her stomach weakly. I feel sick. Alarm bells went off in my head. What's wrong? Fever. She shook her head. My stomach hurts, and I feel nauseous. Before I could react, her face turned ghostly white. She clutched her stomach and bolted to the bathroom. Seconds later, I heard her violently vomiting. My heart pounded as I rushed to her side. Ashley. She continued throwing up, her body shaking. My panic grew. This wasn't normal. I called for Rachel, but she was nowhere to be found. Moments later, Ashley collapsed to the floor, sweating, her breathing shallow. Something was very, very wrong. I grabbed my phone and called Daniel. Come home. Now. It's Ashley. Then, without hesitation, I dialed 911. My daughter is sick. She's vomiting. Her stomach hurts. She's sweating profusely. I think something is seriously wrong. Stay calm, ma'am. An ambulance is on its way. I hung up, gripping Ashley's trembling hand. Hold on, baby. Help is coming. Minutes later, the sound of sirens filled the air. Paramedics rushed in, assessed her, and one of them turned to me with a serious expression. She needs to be transported immediately to Massachusetts General Hospital. I nodded frantically, tears streaming down my face. I'm coming with her. Just before I got into the ambulance, Rachel finally appeared at the top of the stairs. What's going on? She asked, her face unreadable. Ashley's sick. I snapped. We're going to the hospital. I didn't wait for her response. In the ambulance, I held Ashley's hand tightly, whispering, You're going to be okay. But deep down, I knew this was no ordinary illness. Something was very, very wrong. And I was about to find out just how deep the nightmare would go. Whispers in the shadows. The ambulance ride to Massachusetts General felt like an eternity, even though it only lasted 10 minutes. I sat next to Ashley, gripping her ice-cold hand, watching her chest rise and fall in weak, shallow breaths. Her once vibrant face was now pale, her lips dry and cracked. She whimpered softly as another wave of pain tore through her stomach. I brushed damp strands of hair from her forehead and whispered, You're going to be okay. Sweetheart, just hold on. The paramedics moved efficiently, attaching IV lines, monitoring her vitals, but the glances they exchanged told me what they weren't saying. Ashley was getting worse. I held my breath when one of them spoke into his radio. Patient is a 15-year-old female presenting with severe abdominal pain, vomiting, and diaphoresis. Possible toxic ingestion. ETA 5 minutes. Toxic ingestion. My stomach clenched. What did that mean? Had Ashley eaten something bad? A paramedic met my gaze. Mrs. Foster, do you know if your daughter ingested anything unusual today? Medication, food, anything out of the ordinary? I shook my head frantically. No, she had breakfast at home, lunch at school. Nothing strange. She wasn't sick this morning. The paramedic frowned but didn't press further. By the time we reached the ER, Ashley was barely conscious. They wheeled her in on a stretcher while I ran beside them, struggling to keep up. BP is dropping, heart rate elevated. A nurse shouted as they burst through the double doors. Mom. Ashley's voice was barely a whisper. I'm here, baby, I said, but the words felt useless. Then they pushed me back. Mrs. Foster, you'll have to wait outside, a nurse said firmly, blocking the door. No, I need to be with her. I promise we'll do everything we can. And then the doors slammed shut in my face. Daniel arrives, and the first clue. I stood frozen in the waiting area, my fists clenched so tight that my nails dug into my palms. My mind was spinning, jumping to the worst conclusions. Poison. Something inside her was poisoning her. But from what? And how? I barely registered Daniel's arrival until I felt his hands on my shoulders. Meg. His face was pale, his breathing ragged. What happened? I turned to him, my throat thick with emotion. I don't know. She came home looking unwell. And then she collapsed. They think it's some kind of poisoning. Daniel blinked. Poisoning. I nodded. They're running tests. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. Jesus. How? Did she eat something bad? I don't know. My voice cracked. She was fine this morning. She had breakfast with us. Then school. And then. I trailed off. And then Rachel. A chill crawled up my spine. Rachel had been with Ashley all afternoon. I turned to Daniel. Did you call Rachel? He exhaled. Yeah, she said she had something to do and couldn't come. I stiffened. Something to do. Her niece is in the hospital, and she's busy. Daniel looked conflicted. I know. It's weird. But Rachel. I crossed my arms. No, this wasn't just Rachel being flaky. Something was off. Before I could press further, the doctor approached. The diagnosis that changed everything. The doctor, a man in his early 50s with kind but tired eyes, introduced himself. I'm Dr. Patel. Your daughter is stable for now, but her condition is serious. I swallowed hard. What's wrong with her? Dr. Patel sighed. Her symptoms indicate poisoning. We're running toxicology tests to determine the exact cause. But her vitals suggest she's been exposed to something over a prolonged period, rather than a single incident. My blood ran cold. What do you mean, prolonged? Daniel asked. The doctor hesitated. It's possible she's been ingesting small amounts of a toxin over time, leading to this acute reaction. My breath caught. No. I shook my head. That doesn't make sense. She would have been sick before now. Dr. Patel looked sympathetic. Sometimes toxins accumulate in the system until they reach a tipping point. Once we identify what it is, we can treat it more effectively. A sharp, nauseating realization hit me. Someone had been poisoning my daughter. Not once. Not by accident. Over time. I gripped Daniel's arm. Who had access to her food, her drinks, her environment? He looked just as shaken as I felt. Only us, he murmured. And Rachel. The police get involved. An hour later, a nurse led us into Ashley's hospital room. Seeing her so small, so fragile, surrounded by machines, broke something inside me. I sat beside her, taking her cold hand. I'm here, sweetheart, I whispered. Daniel stood beside me, quiet. Then, a soft knock at the door. 2 uniformed officers stood there. Mr. and Mrs. Foster, one of them asked. I'm Detective Harris. This is Officer Reynolds. We'd like to ask a few questions about Ashley's condition. I nodded, numb. We have reason to believe your daughter's illness may not be an accident, Detective Harris said carefully. The hospital flagged her case as suspicious due to the toxicity levels in her system. Daniel paled. Suspicious. Harris nodded. We're treating this as a possible case of poisoning. Can you think of anyone who might have had prolonged access to your daughter's food, drinks, or medicine? I barely hesitated. Rachel. Daniel stiffened. Meg. I turned to the officer. Rachel, my husband's sister, has been staying with us. She's been spending a lot of time with Ashley, and she was acting strange tonight. The officers exchanged glances. Detective Harris pulled out a small notepad. You said she was acting strange. How? She didn't come to the hospital. She said she had something to do. I shook my head. And something else. Ashley's been spending a lot of time with her. More than usual. Officer Reynolds asked, has she ever prepared food or drinks for Ashley? I swallowed. Yes. A tense silence filled the room. Detective Harris closed his notepad. We'd like to speak with Rachel. Daniel hesitated. This is just a theory. We don't know if she actually. Harris nodded. We understand. But given the circumstances, we need to investigate all possibilities. He handed me a card. If you notice anything else suspicious, call me. As they left, Daniel turned to me, his face conflicted. Meg, this is Rachel we're talking about. I met his eyes. Daniel, if we're wrong, I'll apologize. But if we're right, our daughter is in danger. The weight of my words settled between us. And deep down, I already knew. Something was very, very wrong. And Rachel was at the center of it. The dark truth begins to unravel. A mother's instinct. The hospital room was dimly lit, the steady beeping of the monitors the only sound breaking the silence. Ashley lay unconscious, her breathing shallow, her skin unnaturally pale. I had been sitting by her bedside for hours, watching the rise and fall of her chest, praying that she would open her eyes and tell me everything was okay. But deep in my heart, I knew something was terribly wrong. Daniel had fallen asleep in the chair beside me. His arms crossed, his face lined with exhaustion. I couldn't sleep. My mind wouldn't stop racing. Rachel. The moment I mentioned her name to the detectives, I saw it in their eyes, a flicker of recognition, as if they had heard this kind of story before. A sudden illness, suspicious circumstances, a family member who had easy access. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through messages between Ashley and Rachel. A few stood out. Rachel, you should try those herbal supplements I gave you. They'll help with stress. Ashley, thanks, Aunt Rachel. I feel kinda weird after taking them, but I guess it takes time to work, right? My stomach twisted. Herbal supplements. Ashley had never mentioned anything about them. I stood up, heart pounding, and stepped into the hallway. The hospital was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every footstep sound deafening. I needed to talk to the police again. I needed answers. A chilling revelation. Detective Harris and Officer Reynolds were still at the hospital, waiting in a small office near the ER. When I walked in, they both looked up. Mrs. Foster, Harris greeted. Any new thoughts? I hesitated for a split second before showing them the messages. Ashley said Rachel gave her some kind of supplements. I didn't know about this. Harris frowned as he read them. Do you have these supplements at home? I nodded slowly. I think so. If Ashley was taking them regularly, they should still be in her room. Harris exchanged a glance with Reynolds. Mrs. Foster, would you be comfortable with us conducting a search of your home? Yes, I said immediately. Take whatever you need. Harris nodded. We'll send a team over tonight. I exhaled, my hands trembling. Rachel was hiding something, and I was going to find out what. A tense homecoming. I returned home with the officers just after midnight. The house felt eerily empty, the kind of silence that settled deep into your bones. Rachel was nowhere to be seen. "Where is she?" I asked Daniel, who had driven home ahead of me. He rubbed his face. "I called her. She said she'd be back later." "She's avoiding us," I muttered. Harris and Reynolds wasted no time. They headed straight to Ashley's room, carefully combing through her belongings. I stood near the doorway, my arms crossed tightly over my chest, my heart pounding in my ears. Then, "I got something," Harris said, pulling a small white bottle from Ashley's nightstand. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. The label read, "Natural Herbal Relaxant, Organic Formula." It looked harmless. Too harmless. Reynolds unscrewed the cap and sniffed it. His nose wrinkled. "This doesn't smell right." Harris nodded. "We'll have this tested." I stared at the bottle, my stomach twisting into knots. If Rachel had been giving Ashley something harmful under the guise of herbal supplements, then... A loud bang echoed from downstairs. We all froze. Someone had just entered the house. Confrontation in the dark. Rachel stood in the foyer, her purse slung over one shoulder, her expression unreadable. "Rachel," I said, my voice sharp, "where have you been?" She blinked. "Out. I didn't think I needed to report my every move to you." I clenched my fists. "Ashley's in the hospital, fighting for her life. And you just left." Her lips pressed into a thin line. I didn't know it was this serious. Detective Harris stepped forward. "Miss Foster, we have some questions for you." Rachel's eyes flickered between the officers and me, and for the first time, I saw it, the hesitation, the flicker of nervousness. She wasn't just surprised. She was scared. "What's this about?" she asked carefully. Harris held up the bottle. "Did you give this to Ashley?" Rachel's face paled. "It's just supplements. Natural stuff. Then you won't mind telling us where you got it." She hesitated. Too long. And then, for the first time since she arrived, she lost control. "You think I did something to Ashley?" Her voice rose, her eyes wild. "She's my niece. I would never hurt her." "No one said you hurt her," I said coldly. "But you gave her these pills without telling us. And now she's in the hospital." Rachel's hands trembled. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Then make us understand." Harris pressed. For a long moment, Rachel just stood there, her shoulders rising and falling with her uneven breaths. And then, "I didn't mean to," she choked out. Silence. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "What did you do, Rachel?" I whispered. Her eyes filled with tears. I just wanted to help her. She was stressed, anxious, always talking about feeling overwhelmed with school. I thought the supplements would help. Harris's voice was firm. "But what was in them, Rachel?" Rachel swallowed hard. I got them from someone. A friend. He told me they were natural, that they'd just help with relaxation. I didn't think. I didn't know. Reynolds stepped forward. "Who is this friend?" Rachel hesitated. "His name is Colin. He runs a supplement business online. I bought them from him." Harris nodded. "We'll need his information." Rachel's face crumpled. I never meant to hurt her. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But I wasn't sure I could. Answers and more questions. By the time the police left, I felt completely drained. They had taken the bottle for testing, and Rachel had been instructed not to leave town. Daniel sat beside me on the couch, rubbing his temples. "Meg, do you think she's telling the truth?" I exhaled shakily. "I don't know. But I do know that Ashley is in the hospital because of something Rachel gave her." Daniel looked torn, his loyalty to his sister at war with the reality of the situation. I stood up. "I'm going back to the hospital." Daniel followed without hesitation. When we arrived, the doctor met us with an update. We identified the toxin. Dr. Patel said, "Ashley ingested a substance containing high levels of belladonna." My breath caught. Belladonna. As in Deadly nightshade. Dr. Patel nodded gravely. In small doses, it can cause dizziness, nausea, and confusion. But prolonged use, it can be fatal. I felt like I was going to be sick. Ashley had been slowly poisoned. And if we hadn't caught it in time. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting the urge to scream. Rachel had given my daughter poison. Whether she meant to or not, it didn't matter. Ashley had almost died because of her, and I wasn't going to let it go. A truth worse than lies. The breaking point. I stood in the sterile hospital corridor, staring blankly at the white walls, my hands clenched into fists. My heart was still hammering from Dr. Patel's words. Ashley had been poisoned. Not by accident, not by some freak incident. Someone had been feeding her a toxin, slowly, deliberately, over time. And Rachel had been the one giving her those pills. A whirlwind of emotions stormed through me. Rage, betrayal, guilt. I should have stopped this earlier. I should have questioned things the moment I felt something was off. Behind me, Daniel was sitting in one of the hospital chairs, his head in his hands. He hadn't spoken much since we heard the truth. His face was pale, his jaw clenched tight. He was still trying to process what his own sister had done. She swore she didn't mean it. He finally whispered, his voice hoarse. She thought she was helping her. I turned to him sharply. Helping? Daniel, she was poisoning our daughter. My voice cracked with emotion. Ashley almost died. She's lying in there, hooked up to machines, because of Rachel's help. Daniel looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. You think she did it on purpose? I hesitated. Did I? Rachel had always been reckless, always made bad choices, but I thought back to her reaction when confronted. The way her hands trembled, the way she panicked when we mentioned the supplements. She was hiding something. I don't know, I admitted, but I'm going to find out. I grabbed my coat and turned toward the door. Where are you going? Daniel asked. To get the truth. A confrontation long overdue. Rachel was still at our house, waiting. The police had taken her statement, but they hadn't arrested her. Yet, they needed more proof of intent. But I didn't. I slammed the front door open so hard it banged against the wall. Rachel was sitting at the kitchen table, a half-empty cup of tea in front of her. She looked up sharply, eyes widening as she saw me. You lied to me. I spat, my voice shaking with fury. You sat in my house, ate at my table, laughed with my daughter, while you were feeding her poison. Rachel stood abruptly, knocking over her chair. Megan, please. Don't you dare. I cut her off. No more excuses. No more pretending. I want the truth, and I want it now. She swallowed hard. I told you. I didn't know. Colin said the supplements were safe. I slammed my hands on the table. Don't lie to me. Rachel flinched, her eyes darting away. You knew something was wrong. I pushed, stepping closer. You saw Ashley getting sicker. You knew. And you kept giving it to her anyway. Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes. I thought she was just adjusting to them. I never meant to hurt her. I scoffed. You don't get to play the victim, Rachel. Not this time. Silence hung between us, thick and suffocating. Then Rachel whispered something so low I almost didn't hear it. I needed the money. I froze. What? Rachel let out a shaky breath. Colin. He wasn't just selling supplements. He was testing them. The floor felt like it had just disappeared beneath me. I stared at her. Testing. Rachel wiped her tears, her hands trembling. He told me they were all natural, experimental formulas for relaxation. He paid me to find volunteers to try them. He said it was harmless, that it was just for research. I felt like I was going to be sick. You used Ashley as a test subject. My voice was barely a whisper, raw with disbelief. Rachel shook her head violently. No, I mean, yes, but not like that. I thought they were safe. Colin swore they were just supplements, nothing dangerous. I took a step back, my whole body shaking. Ashley hadn't just been poisoned. She had been an experiment. The police arrive. I didn't remember grabbing my phone, but suddenly it was in my hand. Detective Harris answered on the first ring. "Mrs. Foster." "Come to my house," I said, my voice deadly calm. "Now." Rachel's eyes widened. "Megan, please don't. Don't you dare beg me for anything." I snapped. "Not after what you did." 15 minutes later, the police arrived. Rachel didn't fight. She just stood there, her face pale, her hands shaking as they handcuffed her. As she was led away, she turned back to me. "I swear, I didn't mean to hurt her," she whispered. I met her gaze with cold, unrelenting fury. "That doesn't matter," I said, because intent didn't change the fact that my daughter was lying in a hospital bed, fighting for her life. And it didn't change what I was going to do next. A mother's vow. Back at the hospital, I sat beside Ashley's bed, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. Daniel sat beside me, his hand wrapped around mine. "She's going to be okay," he murmured, as if saying it out loud would make it true. I nodded, but my mind was already racing. Rachel was in police custody. But Colin, the man behind all of this, was still out there. I wasn't naive. I knew how the world worked. There were always more men like Colin, people who saw others as disposable, who experimented on the innocent, who thought they could get away with it. I wouldn't let that happen. I leaned forward, brushing a strand of hair from Ashley's forehead. "I promise you, baby," I whispered, "I won't let him get away with this." And I meant it, with every ounce of my being. A mother's justice. The silence before the storm. Days passed. Ashley remained unconscious. The doctors assured us she was stable, but her recovery would take time. The toxins had done damage, more than we had realized. Her body was fighting, but the battle was far from over. I rarely left her side. Daniel and I sat in the hospital room, the beeping machines our only company. He had stopped defending Rachel. He had stopped trying to rationalize what happened. We both knew the truth now. Rachel was just a pawn. The real mastermind, the one responsible for my daughter's suffering, was still out there. Colin. And I wasn't going to wait for the justice system to handle him. I had already lost faith in the system. This was personal. Following the trail, Rachel had given me everything before she was taken into custody. His full name, his phone number, the website he used. It didn't take long to find him. Colin Peterson, a self-proclaimed wellness guru. His website was still active, filled with fake testimonials and promises of life-changing results. I scrolled through the pages, my stomach twisting with every lie he sold to desperate people. The address listed was an office in downtown Boston. It was time to meet him. A mother's wrath. I stood outside the sleek, glass-walled building, watching as people moved in and out. Colin operated under the name Revita Health, an unregistered company selling natural remedies. I had no plan, no backup, just rage. I walked inside, my heels clicking against the polished floor. A receptionist looked up. "Can I help you?" I forced a smile. "I have an appointment with Mr. Peterson." She frowned. "I don't see anything scheduled." I leaned in. "Tell him Megan Foster is here." The woman hesitated but picked up the phone. Moments later, a door opened down the hall. And there he was, Colin Peterson. He was younger than I expected, early 30s, clean-shaven, dressed in a crisp navy suit. He looked more like a businessman than a criminal. But I saw it. The arrogance. The confidence of someone who had gotten away with too much for too long. "Mrs. Foster," he said smoothly, offering a practiced smile. "I wasn't expecting you." I stepped forward, my hands shaking with barely restrained fury. "No, I imagine you weren't." He gestured to his office. "Let's talk privately." I followed him inside, the door clicking shut behind me. A dangerous game. He sat behind a sleek, modern desk, leaning back as if he had all the time in the world. I heard about your daughter, he said casually. Terrible thing. My vision blurred with rage. Terrible. My voice was dangerously low. You poisoned my child. Colin sighed, as if I were being unreasonable. You're emotional. I get it. But let's be clear. I didn't poison anyone. Your sister-in-law made a choice. She gave Ashley those supplements. She bought them from you. He smiled, spreading his hands. I sell products. What people do with them is not my responsibility. I clenched my fists. They were laced with belladonna. His smile didn't falter. A naturally occurring nerve. You're testing on people. I spat. Colin tilted his head. Do you have proof of that? I hated how calm he was. How sure he was that nothing would happen to him. He leaned forward. Look, Mrs. Foster, I understand why you're upset. But let me give you some advice. Walk away. Your daughter is alive. No need to make this worse for yourself. I stared at him. Then I smiled. Because I had him. I pulled my phone from my pocket and turned the screen toward him. The audio was already recording. His face twitched. You're not as careful as you think, I said. And now I have everything I need. For the first time, the confidence slipped. You. Before he could finish, I stood up. Goodbye, Mr. Peterson. Then I walked out. Justice served. I sent the recording to Detective Harris. Within hours, the authorities raided Riverdale. Colin was arrested. His entire operation was exposed. Illegal drug testing. False advertising. Fraud. He wasn't just hurting Ashley. He had been running an underground scheme for years, using unsuspecting people as test subjects for unapproved substances. Rachel, despite everything, took a plea deal. She testified against Colin in exchange for a reduced sentence. I didn't forgive her. I didn't think I ever could. But I was done thinking about her. The only thing that mattered was Ashley. A new beginning. 2 weeks later, Ashley woke up. Her voice was weak, her eyes dazed, but she was there. Alive. I held her hand and whispered, "You're safe now." Tears slipped down my face as she squeezed my fingers weakly. I had been prepared to burn the world down for her. And in a way I had. Colin Peterson was facing prison. Rachel was out of our lives. And Ashley, she had a future again. I leaned down, pressing my lips to her forehead. A silent promise. No one would ever hurt her again. Not as long as I was breathing. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.